Welcome to the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast. Habits, routines, motivations, and mindsets from some of the most successful real estate professionals among us. Check out the show notes at connectpracticetrackgrow.com. This show is brought to you by the strategic resource for real estate professionals, creating and coaching business opportunities and strategies that support and add value to the lives of real estate professionals at thestrategicresource.com, and by Roost Real Estate Company. Today's real estate agent doesn't follow old rules. She makes new ones. Learn more at careerwithroost.com.
Hi, everybody. It's Chris McAllister again with the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast, where it's my job to make your business better and your life easier. I'm back today with my podcast collaborator and our digital marketing director, Laci Leblanc. Good morning, Laci.
Good morning, Chris.
So this is part 4, and there's 5 parts of our deep dive into the long-term ramifications of the recent civil court decision in the case of Sitzer Burnett versus the National Association of Realtors et al. We've covered a lot of ground already in our last 3 sessions, but in this episode, I want to talk about the things I think we can look forward to in the years ahead. And when I say the years ahead, I think in the next, honestly, in this segment, 1 to 3 years. And I think some of the things we're going to see are the widespread adoption and use of buyer agency agreements. I think we're going to hear a lot of conversation about how we're paid, but I think a lot of that is going to end up being semantics in that I think we're going to hear discussions of offers of compensation versus offers of a referral fee. I think the other thing that we've got to deal with going forward, as we have for quite a while, is commission compression. And in that discussion, I thought it was kind of interesting to see how agents and brokerages are compensated in other countries outside of the United States, because I think to some degree that's coloring the debate based on the research I've done the past few weeks, and start to touch on what kind of new business opportunities might present themselves. So that's a lot for this close to Christmas, I think.
It is a lot, but it's very exciting. You know, if you're me, I'm still trying to wrap my head around all of it, right? So the kind of forward-looking aspect of it, this is where it starts to get legitimately kind of exciting, a little scary, but I think more good than bad, because we can finally talk through, the implications of this and not just the immediate consequence, which is fear, right?
Yeah. And I'm a lot less apprehensive, now that I've gone through this with you the past few weeks than I was when my agents first started asking me about it. So the process is helpful for me.
Right. And I hope that sharing your process, because not everybody, is as passionate about this or has as much time for this, especially during the holidays at the end of the year, right? So you doing all of the legwork for folks and then sharing what you've learned is, I hope, super helpful for the agents who are listening and might be a little fearful themselves.
I hope so too. So I want to start off with the fact that commission compression is coming. The ultimate reason for this lawsuit was there was a consensus amongst the plaintiffs, those who brought the suit, that the commissions they agreed to pay their agents' brokers to sell their homes were too high, and that they were essentially artificially inflated. And that's what, in a word, made it criminal. Now, we've been talking about commission compression for decades, probably since the beginning of the realtor community. But I think now we're going to see it come from more of a legal antitrust perspective than we have before. For the best among us, we've always been able to show our value and articulate what we bring to the table, either as a buyer agent or a listing agent. And, when somebody wanted to, negotiate their, our commission, we had good, solid pushback, right? For lack of a better term, right? And my favorite line was, if you can't trust me to negotiate my own commission, how can you trust me to negotiate the best deal on your property or your purchase? So, we've always had pressure on commission, but I think it's going to be coming at us from different places, not just from, a buyer or a seller at the kitchen table.
Do you think that part of that is because homes were selling for everywhere, astronomical amounts of money for a period, right? Do you think that 3% or 6% started to really hurt more because homes were selling higher? Or do you think that's not connected?
I have some thoughts on it that I do want to get into today. But, one of the things is, when you talk about commission compression, yes, the dollars have gone up for each transaction as the prices have gone up, but the percentages haven't. If anything, at higher end prices, commissions have dropped, anywhere from a half to a full point, depending on the price of the house. So I don't think it's that. I think there's a bit more to it. And when I think back to these people who had already hired their realtors, already sold their houses, and then got together and went back and sued us, I have to believe they didn't understand, or they were not made aware that the contracts they signed for the commission they agreed to pay, those were always negotiable, right? Commissions are always negotiable. There is nothing set in stone. A buyer or seller can choose to negotiate. They can choose to pay what they will. If they don't want to pay a commission and they'd rather do it themselves, they can always go for sale by owner and even put their properties on Zillow themselves, and even decide if they want to pay a co-op fee to a buyer agent, as a for sale by owner. So they can go that route. There's also still many actually, discount brokers out there in the world, or fee for service brokers. So the whole thing still, as we've talked about, just seems patently unfair because there are options everywhere in the country, including Missouri, right? You can go.
Yeah. So I guess as the daughter of a car dealer, I just have been raised to know that everything has a price, everything's for sale, and it's always negotiable. So,
Yeah.
So that's a good point that you make, is not everybody was raised by a car dealer or, and in this case, a very honest and, and one I would want to be like, right? Which is not always the impression of car dealers, but not everybody, I guess, knows. And that is not something I had considered, that they just didn't realize that they didn't have to. It was 3% is not mandatory, right?
3%, 6%, 10%, nothing's mandatory. And as I said in the last episode, I don't think we've done as good job as we could have, and as we used to, quite frankly, explaining how we agents get paid and where that money comes from. I think I think we stopped educating the public as to how these numbers work and why. I do believe that for the most part, for a huge degree, I shouldn't say the most part, that we fail to articulate our value as true professionals. And the fact that the buyer agent function is the part of the process that's being deemed overvalued, that's proof right there, in my opinion, that we haven't done a good job telling our story. Because, as I said last week, it's the buyer agent that holds this whole thing together. And it's not all our fault. I was pretty down on us last time, because, I do believe we brought some of this on ourselves. But I have to also acknowledge that COVID and the whole frenzy in the housing market it produced, it led to an over-reliance on email, text, and dot loop. And I think one of the potential reasons that, sellers cited that they, in retrospect, overpaid, right, and wanted to sue was, we didn't have to talk to sellers. It was the kind of situation where, first of all, they didn't want us in the house, right? It was COVID. So everything was done online. I have to tell you, the whole dot loop thing, or whatever contract signing service you use, is a little bit frightening, because it's one thing when you sit across the kitchen table from somebody, or sit across Starbucks with somebody, and you go through a contract with a person face to face. It's quite another when you're relying on that client to page through 10, 12, 15 pages of a contract, read every line and understand it before they hit the auto signature, right? So it wasn't entirely our fault that we stopped talking or educating our clients, because, quite frankly, our clients had no reason or use or desire to talk to us. It was a time when you stuck a sign in the yard and you sat back for 15 minutes and suddenly you had multiple offers coming in. That's
a great point. That's when I was trying to buy a house, was in that exact. And I ended up in my grandfather's house after he passed away, and we had really given up because we had made so many offers on so many houses, and there were just literally dozens of offers on every house so it didn't matter if we were, and, it didn't matter if we were just the right person for the house. A lot of those things that looking back on real estate, kind of those nuanced parts of coming to an agreement between buyer and seller were no longer valid. So I think that, that's a really good point, that they didn't see the value. In addition to maybe not articulating the value, there really was a lot less work that had to be done in that time period. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, we didn't get the chance to talk to us, and they weren't inviting us. We didn't get the chance to talk to them, and they certainly weren't inviting us to talk to them. There was, and it is a little sad though, that, they want their money back, so to speak. And, maybe we didn't have time to educate, or maybe there wasn't an opportunity to educate. But by the same token, the hours that those listing agents put in managing those multiple offers and communicating those multiple offers and sharing those multiple offers, I mean, that was a hell of a time.
Right. And who was still doing their whole job and just even more hours than usual was buyer's agents, right? Nana was, we put in however many offers, and we would see a different house, every day that we wanted to look at or make an offer on or consider. And Nana was, answering my phone calls sometimes 6 or 7 times a day. And I know that's my family, but, buyer's agents were still there was even more work for them.
And, maybe for the transactionists among us, COVID was a fantastic time. The last 3 or 4 years were great for them. They were in and out of the business. But, for those of us who thrive on relationships, build our business around relationships, like to talk and educate people and consult and make things better for them, it was a tough time because, those services, were hard to offer, when you're not belly to belly and not everybody's comfortable with Zoom and things like that. So one of the things is, we were thinking about, why are our commissions outrageously high? So I did a little research, and, I'll just go through this quickly. But so let's look at Great Britain. So what I learned was Great Britain is a lot like the United States, and the rate typically runs between 2 to 6% of the property's final selling price, with the exact rate depending on the agent's experience, location, et cetera, et cetera. And that's no different than here. We have assist to sell type opportunities where, properties get into the MLS for very little money, and maybe there is a very small co-op offered or no co-op offered at all. And that, so the average, of course, is, I'm assuming is much higher than 2%. But yeah, you could easily sell your house in the United States for less than 2%. Those choices are out there in the world. And of course, you can always go it alone. The other thing that I learned in Great Britain was, in many cases, sometimes there's a flat fee involved in the commission, or instead of a commission, or it's a combination of commission and flat fee. So I think that's kind of interesting. And when you think about, some of the brokerages that charge, a listing fee, a commission, there's also some sort of administration fee or some sort of additional flat fee on there. So, if somebody's advertising or saying that they're going to sell your house for X percent, oftentimes at many brokerages, there's an additional fee that goes on that. So it's, 7% plus $1,000 or whatever. So anyway, that's Great Britain. Australia, this is interesting. From what I saw, in Australia, commission rate typically range from 1.5 to 3% of the final selling price, with the rate varying depending on this, the same thing that we talked about in, here in Great Britain. This was interesting. In Australia, some agents receive a salary and bonuses, but these are typically only offered to experienced agents with a track record of success. So, it's funny you mentioned, I didn't know your family was in the car business, but I've often thought about that model, as I understand it, is, it's almost a draw against commission, right? A salesperson at a car dealership is a W-2 employee, I believe, and they get a salary. And then when they hit a certain number, they also draw a bonus. Is that correct?
I would have to ask my brother. It's a family car dealership, so I think they have a little more control over their pay structure. But that is typically how a car dealership works, yes.
Exactly. And, it sounds like in Australia anyway, it's a profession where, you can be on a salary with your broker, which I think is an interesting model that is somewhat like I understand car dealerships. In Canada, it's almost identical to the United States. They said the rates can go as low as 1.5 up to 6%. And again, it depends on the agent, the brokerage, the area, the price of the house, and so forth. I even went and looked in other parts in Germany and other parts of Europe. I thought this was interesting. It says the compensation structure for residential real estate agents in Germany is primarily a fixed fee system. Agents are typically paid a percentage of the property's value, but the percentage is relatively low, around 2 to 3%. The system is designed to ensure that agents are not incentivized to overprice properties. So I think that's interesting. But in
That is
China,
really interesting.
and it looks like
About
all of Europe, every country in Europe is different, almost like every state in the United States is different.
Right. Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about how, and we can talk about this later, but I don't want to forget it. Is, ideally, it's kind of like when somebody says, I don't want to win the lottery because I'd have to pay most of it in taxes. Right. But you end up with all that money that you didn't have before anyway. So it really doesn't. If you won $1 million and you had to pay, $999,999 in taxes, you'd still have one more dollar than you had before. And I think about, ideally with the help of an agent, you sell your home, there's value add, right? You sell your home for more than you would without an agent. And that's enough to cover, right? So that's the value conversation. I don't know why that just occurred to me while you're talking about this, but
and those facts are absolutely true. And again, because of the way, the antitrust lawsuit was structured, that those discussions weren't allowed. That defense wasn't allowed to be made in the courtroom, and we're going to have to wait for appeal. I also think it's interesting, it's like you said, even if you have to pay tax, you're still ahead. If you're in a situation where you're on some sort of salary and bonus, and maybe that's less than your gross commission, but don't forget the other side of the equation. You're not having to put all that money into marketing or office supplies or this and that. If you're an employee and, that stuff is provided by your employer. So there's, trade-offs either way. And it's funny you talk about taxes. People say, well, I get to write all this off. Well, that's great, but you only get to write it off if you have any income to write it off against. Sometimes we forget how that math works. But anyway, in Asia, in China, the compensation structure for real estate is more diverse. Commission-based compensation is common. There are also trends towards fixed fees and salaried positions. And this is because of the government being so directly involved in oversight and regulation. In Japan, it's primarily a fixed fee system. They're paid a predetermined fee for each successful sale, regardless of the property's value. The system is designed to promote fairness and transparency. And that's an interesting argument, right? I mean, does it really? Yes, it may take more expertise or different expertise to sell $1 million home. No question about it. You've got to be able to relate to the $1 million buyer. But from a actual task and work perspective, to get that done, to fill out a contract, to get it on the MLS, is the work any greater than $100,000 property, right? Is it 10 times greater? And when you have set percentages or traditional percentages that are applied by price, I can see the argument where, there's a predetermined fee for a successful sale.
Yeah, definitely. That's there's a meme here. There's t-shirts that are popping up on my TikTok feed from tradesmen and women and it says, you're not paying me for, the 2 hours it takes me to do the job. You're paying me for the 20 years of experience that I bring to the table. Right. So when you think about an hourly rate, and the same thing happens with marketing, in a marketing position, I think about how attractive it is for me and how many times in my life, well into my career, I've chosen less pay in exchange for a stake in, the success of whatever, company I'm working with. And that's based on, the kind of the value. So, if I'm going into a small business and their goal is to grow from, 5 customers a day to 10, then maybe I'd rather just get paid hourly and we can move forward. But when I'm looking at a franchise or something that's trying to grow, then I would much rather take less now and have a stake in what I see as the potential success of that business. So yeah, I do think that it's a different mindset, and it's one that's not as prevalent here. I think we kind of see the value of folks in kind of the hours they work, right?
And that goes back to, the whole idea of the new real estate professional. Your value is based on, not just the service, but the expertise and wisdom that you provide. And, a professional is always looking to grow that expertise and wisdom. And as a professional, they deserve to get paid. One other Asian country, it says Singapore. This was interesting. The compensation structure for residential real estate agents is a hybrid of commission and fixed fee. Agents typically receive a commission on the sale of the property, but the commission rate is capped at a certain percentage. The system is designed to balance the interests of agents and consumers. So it does sound like in Asian countries anyway, and I don't know if they have a concept of agency, but the idea of agency and actual compensation seem to be a little bit better aligned than our system. The other thing that I believe influences our compensation structure or maintains our compensation structure is Zillow. I feel like Zillow has become a symbol of everything that's right and everything that's wrong about the real estate industry in the United States. And this is interesting too. Zillow is basically, I want to say only but their broad strength is in the United States and Canada. They haven't expanded into Europe or elsewhere in the world. So Zillow is a product of the United States, how the United States real estate market is structured. But I also think that Zillow has a huge vested interest in maintaining the current status quo, right? And my guess is if Zillow had been named in this suit, they would have decided to fight it just like, Keller did and Home Services did, because I think Zillow, quite frankly, has as much or more to lose than the mega brokerages, the mega franchisors, and the National Association of Realtors. So, it's more homogenous, I think is the word I'm looking for, in the United States and Canada, whereas in Europe, for instance, it's fragmented. There's different countries, different regulations, customs. They have their own individual portals in countries in Europe. Their privacy regulations are much more strict in Europe than they are in the United States. And that alone makes it hard for Zillow to take their footprint and expand it all over the world. But I do believe Zillow is the biggest contributor to the status quo in this country. And, clearly, I think their influence is beyond from a financial perspective. And I would say that their influence is certainly beyond any single mega brokerage. I mean, Zillow is a money-making machine. The problem with Zillow is we as broker owners are not making that money, but we're making it possible, right? They get our listings for free, and then they sell them back to us at a profit. And their dominant share was solidified during COVID. I mean, the fact is, we did have people looking at Zillow, and regardless of the quality of the pictures or the videos, and making decisions to buy homes, all over the country sight unseen. And I think the negative result of that, the buyer's remorse that came later, is another thing that has happened to the real estate profession that's made us, look bad. Because if they made a bad buy, you got to blame somebody, and it might as well be, the guy you brought your house from. But I do believe, Zillow will fight to the death to keep things as they are. And think about Zillow, right? At least in my world, and I think anybody who owns a house, it's like Kleenex or Xerox, right? Zillow, you say Zillow, you know exactly what you're talking about. It's a brand name that is just crazy. And, people ask me, Laci, how I came up with the name with Roost, and my pat answer is Zillow was already taken.
Well, it's smart, honestly. Yeah, Zillow is, but how much confidence does the average consumer have in Zillow, right? Somebody who's outside of the industry, how much confidence does the average consumer have that the information there is accurate?
Well, I think most brokerages and agents worth their salt, as well as the National Association of Realtors, and of course, NAR's allegiance, if there is any, is to realtor.com. But I think that we've all done our best to, this sounds terrible, Laci, but to discredit Zestimates. Because if, our listing expertise is only confined to getting the price right, I think that we're feeling pretty devalued, right? So I do think that maybe there's a stalemate there between whether Mr. and Mrs. Seller trusts Zillow more than their agent. Here's the thing, right? Zillow estimates get better year after year. And with all of the data they've accumulated over the past, almost 20 years, and with all of the general artificial intelligence tools that we all have access to, but certainly, $1 billion company does, is just making that much better. It's hard to say, right, that those numbers aren't good. Where you need local expertise and where you need us, quite frankly, is what is the actual condition of the home, interior and exterior. If it's an older home, it's not a cookie cutter home, a tract home, what are the design elements, right? Is it conducive to today's living standards, or is it functionally obsolete, right? So many beautiful older homes, maybe they don't have a kitchen that's quite like what we want kitchens to be today, or, maybe there's a pass-through bedroom, there's any number of things. And I do think Zillow is getting better at, taking into account surroundings, because, let's face it, Google Maps, everybody else's maps, you can basically look at a satellite image or a street view and get a pretty good handle on, what the surrounding area looks like. And I think that, if it hasn't already, will ultimately factor in to those Zestimate calculations. So, I know this is unpopular, but Zillow in that respect is doing a great job. And the other thing that's happened with Zillow is, I remember when we had to spend, $1,000 a week putting listings in the newspaper. Remember those? And now Zillow puts them up for free. But like I said, I think it's been a Faustian bargain, so to speak, in that we've got all this for free, and, they've basically taken what we do and have done it better, and then they're selling it back to us. To one degree or another, we're all working for Zillow, and that makes me a little bit nervous, or at least I see it as an existential anxiety.
Sure. Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because, you mentioned Kleenex and Xerox, and those, brands are synonymous with trust. And, you trust that Kleenex is by far the best tissue, right, that you're going to get for your nose. But I'm not going to pay for Kleenex. I typically will buy Puffs or what, you know what I mean? Xerox is, we can, I guess, we won't talk about making copies in the digital age, but, it's just a lot of the value of those brands are because they have earned the trust of consumers. So I just don't know where Zillow is at in that process. And I think that, until Zillow is there and has that kind of trust, then, maybe we're not quite ready for Zillow to take over the real estate world. But if they are there, then it seems like it would be a lot closer.
I think I don't know this for sure, but I'm thinking it's generational. So being in the industry, I didn't trust Zillow. Watching what they've done over the years, I'm starting to trust them more. There's estimates. My guess is that, baby boomers, like myself, even some Gen Xers, maybe we have less faith in that newfangled technology. But I would bet, and we're going to talk about guessing and betting on our next episode, but I would bet that the younger folks that grew up with technology and the internet and so forth, they have a lot more faith in this estimate maybe than some of the older folks do.
Yeah, really interesting point. As a Zennial, who is an elder millennial who grew up on the cusp, right? I think I still have a healthy degree of, skepticism, but also highly comfortable with it. So that's maybe why I'm also in the middle of, do we trust them or don't we? So that makes sense.
But I'm not taking it at face value. I'm taking it because I'm in it, and I look at it and I watch it, and I'm amazed at how much better it's gotten. So again, I'm going to get hate mail for saying that at all. So we'll leave that there for the time being.
Any mail is good mail, Chris. Any mail is good mail. That means somebody's listening,
That's right. So what I think what we're probably going to see is, some tweaking to this whole cooperative compensation model. I do think when it's all said and done that, we're going to be okay. But one way that I've read and seen that our compensation structure may be preserved, but slightly tweaked, is that there's a distinction between what is an offer of compensation versus offering a referral fee, right? And in the real estate industry, we use both terms, but the terms, and they're often used interchangeably, but there is a distinction between the two. And I think this gets into the ultimate resolution of the antitrust questions. So an offer of compensation is a broad term that encompasses any form of payment that a listing brokerage offers to a buyer brokerage in exchange for bringing a buyer to the property, right? This could be, because it's negotiable, a percentage of the sales price, a flat fee, or a combination of both. That's how we've been living the past few years. That's what the Clear Cooperation Standard is all about. Referral fee is a more specific term that refers to a fixed fee that is paid to a buyer brokerage for referring a client to the listing brokerage. The fee is typically paid regardless of whether or not the transaction closes. That's an interesting thought too. That implies that there's some amount of money, probably not a lot of money, that's going to be paid just for referring the buyer, and maybe more money is paid if the buyer actually follows through with the transaction. So you could argue that if I'm, quote, a buyer's agent, do I care if what I'm getting is called a referral fee or an offer of compensation? I may not, right? But from an antitrust perspective, I think that's a distinction that may matter, and we may see that this is how it plays out. So when you think about it, all referral fees are offers of compensation, but not all offers of compensation are referral fees. Referral fee is simply one type of offer of compensation. Does that make sense, or if I just talk circles around the whole day?
No, it does, but it's a little scary that that it could go from offers of compensation, that broad term, to a referral fee, right? Is that what you're saying? Because a referral fee, especially the part where whether or not a transaction closes, it's like you're paying for leads, right? Like it's like you pay Zillow a referral fee for your leads, right? Technically, that's what it is.
Well, we're actually paying for a stream of leads from Zillow, and those aren't exclusive leads either. But you have to think about this, though. If there's some adjustments and some definitions and legal terms, would that be a better outcome for the realtor community? Would that be better than an outright decoupling, right? Where, suddenly, like we talked about in the first episode, buyers and sellers hire and pay their own agents individually. And it's completely separate. So would we rather have a, quote, adjustment that essentially preserves what we have today, or would we prefer to, have it go completely the other direction and end up with an out and out decoupling?
I think it all depends on, again, it goes back to how morally, how good are these agents, right? So if you've got agents who hold themselves to a high standard of professionalism, then you don't have to worry about any of this being taken advantage of, even the way it's currently done, right? The way that's under scrutiny right now. But as soon as you start to get agents who maybe don't hold themselves or who are in dire situations themselves, right? Like you talked about trying to pay their own mortgage this month. Then are we referring buyers to sellers and to listing agents who aren't really qualified, or, who maybe aren't even interested in that home? I think you'll talk about it when we talk about buyer agency, right? But it does. It just opens up a whole new can of worms, right? to address.
Well, regardless, whether, in the next year, 2, 3, whatever it is, if we end up with some, quote, tweaks to the existing model, or we end up with a completely new model based on decoupling, the one thing that I think is absolutely clear to me is that exclusive buyer agency agreements are the way forward. And I think we're going to see them be adopted, honestly, all over the country, at least far more so than we do today. As I've said before, I have always resisted the buyer agency agreements, for 22 years. But it was easy for me to do that because they weren't really common where I practiced in Ohio. A few people used them, but I never did. And even the people that used them sort of did it to protect themselves from, a buyer, going off and buying a house with another agent, right? And that's what they were used for. And as I've said, I was always, and for that reason alone, I always took the approach that, if right or wrong, if I wasn't providing the value that buyer agent needed or deserved, then they had every right to go work with somebody else. So I wasn't trying to force somebody into sticking with me, right, contractually. So for whatever reason, I always resisted it. I've always been an advocate of NAR's clear cooperation policy, and I structured my personal practice that way and my brokerage that way. We created Roost Real Estate basically with, in line with the clear cooperation policy. So the thing is, if we do end up going that way where, we do end up contracting with buyers directly and they're paying our fees, or whether it doesn't go all the way, but we start to adopt buyer agency agreements, exclusive or otherwise, the fact is we have got to get comfortable with being able to articulate our value as buyer agents, just as we've been able to do so with sellers, for years with exclusive right to sell agreements. So I think it's doable. I think that the best among us will make that transition just fine. And quite frankly, it'll probably strengthen the reputation of the industry, restore some of that honor we talked about last time. So anyway, so what's the upside, right? If to using a buyer agency agreement? Well, using a buyer agency agreement, the ultimate outcome is that agency law becomes aligned with compensation. The other upside is sellers will probably pay less in commission and pocket the cash, right? Again, if we go back to the idea that a standard listing rate, and again, this is just what we see on the internet, is 6%, and half of that goes to the firm that brings the buyer. I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect that sellers would pay 3% instead of 6%, and they would pocket the difference. So good on sellers. I think it would be potentially great news for real estate investors, because I think it would push first-time buyers and people of limited means out of the market, and that those folks will continue to rent, whereas they otherwise may have been able to buy their first home. So it's a plus for real estate investors if this happens. The other upside, again, and I know I sound like I'm repeating myself, but this is going to force us to articulate and justify our value as buyer agents. And again, it's not that hard. I mean, if I really want to, piss people off, Laci, to be honest, I think it's the list side of the transaction that is ripe for commission compression far more so than the buyer side. But I also believe that the new real estate professional, the people that we aspire to be and the people we aspire to support and work with, I think that we will ultimately create a career that's based on what I'm thinking of as real estate consultancy. I think that perversely, the use of buyer agency agreements is probably going to start to blur the distinction between what a listing agent does and what a buyer agent does. And I do think technology will have a lot to do with that. And I think, quite frankly, Zillow will have a lot to do with that. And
that's a very cool idea I'm excited to kind of map that out and explore that with you moving forward, because, that's what the new real estate professional does. The listing agent, being a market maker, right, is part of it. And so the distinction between listing and buying is blurred, because the whole point is I want to sell this house for my seller, and I want to find the right house for my buyer. And if I can align those, then, I'm a market maker. And the motivation is very pure in that way. And so I think that you're right. This is a really, you say the new real estate professional is going to be fine and they're going to, really have a lot of opportunities moving forward. But that's a really kind of tangible thought for maybe the first time, is that market making, while all this time I've been thinking, well, market making seems like it's going to take a hit. Actually, it seems like the opposite.
Market making is going to become the thing that sets the new real estate professional apart from everybody else. The number one responsibility of the new real estate professional is to be a market maker. Anybody who hires us to sell their home expects us to sell it. The days of sticking a sign in the yard and waiting for the offers to roll in from every other agency in town are, I'm going to say, over. At least they're over for me. But yeah, that's the number one thing, is market making. And, what used to be a big deal, doing comparative market analyses, that's what Zillow's all about. I don't want to get too deep in this, but if you trust that the Zestimate is a great number, all things being equal, and your job is to get a really good handle on the condition of the property, and your expertise is down to discounting the Zestimate in keeping with the actual hyper-local market, that street, basically, what's selling and what's not, and the condition of that property, the design of that property, that's critical, no question. That's great. But it's not, and here I am, I'm going to get in trouble, Laci, but I don't know that's worth, what we've been paid for that in the past. So
Right.
what's the downside to working with buyer agency agreements and decoupling, right? Many buyers are not going to be able to afford representation. But having said that, if it does go this route, I think that if it does happen, that we will see new regulations allowing new types of buyer closing costs to be included or allowed as seller pay closing costs. Right now, there's different caps for Fannie and Freddie on exactly what type of closing costs and how much those closing costs can be that a seller is allowed to pay, which of course has always been negotiable. And it could very well be that a buyer agent fee becomes an allowed closing cost that is still negotiated with the seller, but credited to the buyer from the seller so that the buyer has less out-of-pocket cost, right? So it just reiterates the fact that it's absolutely negotiable. I think the other thing that could happen is, housing is just critical to the United States economy. Nobody's going to do anything or allow anything that's going to mess with that. So if it does end up that this decoupling happens, which, I think a full decoupling, I think is less likely, that you may even be able to see more buyer side closing costs, be allowed to be rolled into mortgages, especially for first time buyers. So that's just pure speculation on my part, but I think it's grounded in reality. And again, every commission and every referral fee is negotiable. It's when we forget that or we stop saying those words that we as real estate brokers and real estate professionals get in trouble. None of this means that we ever will work for free, but it does mean that we're going to work for people who pay us. And, we're professionals, and there will be more and more people in the market. My guess is that if this really goes against us, that, we'll choose to go it alone. And maybe that means that there's, fewer transactions and so forth. But I think that also means that just like there's people that decide that we're of no value and they want to do it themselves, I think ultimately they're going to hurt themselves. And I think it means that the people who appreciate what we do are always going to be willing to pay for it. We have to guard against the old days of buyer beware. I didn't take Latin in high school, but I think that's caveat M, right? We can't go back to the bad old days before agency law, where, the buyer was just on their own and the seller held all the cards. That's why we have agency law today. If it does go all the way back to the bad old days, let the buyer beware. I think you're going to see more and more people forego home ownership altogether. And that's clearly a downside. And again, housing is critical to the United States economy. Home ownership has always been promoted as a path to wealth. No politician is going to mess with that. I do think, and I have this as a downside, Laci, but I think many of the diehard realtors that we've talked about, the disillusioned and the deal makers, there's going to be a lot of us that are going to be unwilling or unable to make the shift. And we are going to see more and more, realtors leave the business. From a practical standpoint, when I went to this broker meeting in Columbus a couple of weeks ago discussing the lawsuit, it was interesting because we talked about the whole buyer agency agreement. And like I said, I always looked at the buyer agency agreement as a way to handcuff the buyer to the agent, right? And I always felt a little odd about that. But, if you sign a buyer agency agreement, and again, I don't mean to say that, I don't want to violate any trust law, but let's say you sign a buyer agency agreement and just for kicks, let's say that it's 4%, that, a buyer signs let's say this is $2,000. Let's just do that. The buyer signs a agreement with me as quote their buyer agent. And once I successfully, get them in contract and they close, they're going to owe me or my brokerage $2,000, right? But then let's say that the house that they choose to purchase actually is offering a referral fee or a co-op to the firm that brings the buyer. And let's just say that's $1,000, right? So in that situation, the buyer has signed a contract saying that we, as the buyer broker agency, are going to get $2,000. They are going to get $1,000 from the seller. So their out of pocket and additional closing costs is only another $1,000. So it does protect us as agents from, a lot of potential commission compression, I think, because it doesn't necessarily mean, and this was sort of enlightening for me when I realized it doesn't necessarily mean that, every buyer is going to have to pay 3% or 4% or 5% or $2,000 or whatever it is. But it may mean that it's going to be the difference between whatever co-op or whatever referral fee the seller has chosen to offer through their listing brokerage.
Right. But with protection but with protection comes some limitations, right? So in this world that we live in right now, right this minute, you can get your $2,000 and then you could get your $1,000, right? But if that automatically goes towards the $2,000, then you're capped, right? So you're protected, you definitely get paid, right? But you're also capped, whereas, and what happens if, maybe they're offering more, the buyer gets to pocket that. Great for the buyer, right?
Yeah,
that's fantastic for the buyer, but it's capped you as an agent. So, in exchange for that protection, there is some limitation that I see. And honestly, if you're negotiating an agency contract with a buyer and that the buyer's budget is in the, $100,000 range, let's go back to the 1980s or whenever, then are you going to charge $2,000? And then if their price range is in the 500,000 mark, are you going to charge, what would equal 2 or 3% of that? Right. So there's still, it doesn't necessarily solve anything. I think it definitely just, right, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
What you just illustrated was the fact that these fees always have been, always will be negotiable, period. Right. It's completely up to how that buyer or seller wants to work with their agent and how the buyer and seller, come to terms on a purchase price. So,
ultimately, the ball has, the responsibility has always been in the buyer or the seller's court to do their due diligence to find the right agent for them, right? Mm-hmm. That charges something they're comfortable with, that, offers the services they want or need, that, that their personalities match. It's really no different. It still falls on the buyer or the seller to do the work up front to find the right agent for them, is what I'm taking away from all of it.
No, I agree. I agree with you completely. So let's talk about potential changes to individual state licensing laws. I think that we're going to see more states force changes to MLS rules that will make it easier for NAR licensees to list properties on the MLS. And we have several states, as we discussed last week, that have done just that. You're going to see state antitrust laws change in response to whatever happens at the federal level. Right now, they're just like there are federal antitrust laws, or each individual state has different antitrust laws. And as the states exert more authority and control, that could lead to changes that might limit the power of the National Association of Realtors. We'll likely see new consumer protection laws come up at the state level. If this really goes south, I think you're going to see more and more regulations and disclosure requirements, which isn't necessarily all bad, but, governments are governments, bureaucracies are bureaucracies, so they may be more annoying than we would like.
Yeah, red tape is red tape.
Yeah, I think there's going to be changes in pre-licensing and continuing education classes, with more of an emphasis on antitrust laws and consumer protection regulations. We've always talked not in depth about antitrust issues, other than saying that, we're not going to collude, we're not going to do this and so forth. But I think that's going to become more pronounced regardless of how this plays out. The other thing that's interesting is licensees are probably going to be required to disclose to their client if they are members of NAR. And that's a weird thing because,
shift.
We've always grown up that, we're realtors,
it's a badge you wear proudly.
Yeah. And potentially maybe the NAR affiliation isn't the badge of honor that it used to be. And if they lose in the court of public opinion, we may not to be. I can see it possible that, as practitioners, we may not want to wave the NAR flag, and it may be a requirement that we have to disclose in writing if we're, quote, members or not. So I think that's interesting too. That might be a little bit too out there, but it's on the table. It's not improbable. So I want to sort of foreshadow what we're going to talk about in the last episode the next time we get together. But, just for a little bit here, let's kind of get to the fun part. What new business opportunities might present themselves in the years ahead. How's that sound to you?
Oh, yeah. This is the good stuff now.
Yeah. Well, this is a preview of the really good stuff that I really want to dig into time. But
I'll try
anyway,
not to skip too far ahead.
with increased scrutiny of traditional commission-based models, real estate brokers and owners may explore alternative pricing models that are more transparent and competitive. This could include flat-free listings, tiered pricing plans, performance-based compensation. And it's so funny that this is, quote, a new business opportunity, because we have seen different agents and different companies do these types of things. And, we realtors have always ended up referring to them as, quote, discount brokerages, which is actually contrary to NAR rules, by the way. But it's not like these ideas haven't existed before. I think that the reality is coming out of this, maybe that they get traction for the first time, that they become a meaningful percentage of the business. So, one way to combat commission compression is to, compress your own commission out front. So,
do
I
it
think
before they can, right?
Yes. Do it before they can do it to you. So I do think that we're going to see different business models,
Gimmicks.
approaches, different gimmicks. Yeah, I think there's going to be some gimmicks. And
I feel like it's going to be from a marketing standpoint, I feel like it's going to be very gimmicky. And like right now, there's probably 10 billboards I could throw a rock and hit that say, we'll get you an offer on your home today. Right. Yeah. Like if you don't want to take it, we'll still sell it for you. But like, we'll get you an offer today. Well, in my mind, I'm like, well, that's a gimmick. And they're going to offer me way less than what my house is worth just to get me an offer today. Right. It's not going to be a real offer. Exactly. And so I look at it with a lot of skepticism, and I don't see that as a valid option. Do you think that's going to change?
I think we could see more of things like that, quite frankly. I really do. I think we're going to see. And it's hard to imagine what these might be, but there's talk out there that we're going to see brokerage models that aren't bound by traditional National Association of Realtor rules. And remember, one of the reasons we discovered that RE/MAX and Anywhere chose to disassociate with NAR and not make it a requirement that their franchisees and agents join was that they didn't want to have to abide by NAR rules. So this could also mean that we're going to see some different ideas, whether from the mega brokerages or from some independents that offer more flexibility and choice to both agents and clients. And, I think as we start talking about where can we get some efficiencies out of the process, and we talk about, artificial intelligence and scale and process and things like that, I do think we're going to see some changes, and it's a question of who gets to market first. Increasing importance of technology. We've been talking about technology and the internet since I've had a license, but as it's always been, those broker owners who embrace, technological advancement are going to gain a significant advantage. Some of this stuff, has stuck. Some of it hasn't, but I do think that virtual reality tours, are we going to see more and more of those? I think the price is going to go down. I think the technology to actually take those pictures is going to go down, become more efficient. And the beauty of those tours is, for me, Laci, is personally, I don't like to sit and watch a video that an agent makes, going all the way through the house. My feeling is I want to jump to the kitchen. I want to jump to this living room. I want to see the basement. I want to see the office. I want to see the media center, right? So I think that there is some wonderful technology out there that allows you to look at a floor plan of a house, click on the room you want to see, and then see that 3D tour of that individual room. I think that kind of thing is very useful. And I think it's going to become more prevalent. The reason the realtors have not embraced that is it does indeed make the house the star of the show, as it should be. Whereas a lot of the realtor videos, the realtor's the star of the show. So I think that's going to continue, because it really is about adding value, and it's about reducing friction. And you've got a great virtual reality tour. It does make it more likely and more confident for somebody to buy a house, sight unseen.
So I shouldn't tell the realtors that when I have to watch a video that they've made, I turn my volume all the way down and put it on like 3 times speed and try to just pretend like they're not even there. That would hurt their feelings, it sounds like.
You're not going to hurt my feelings, but yes, you will hurt some of our feelings. And that's exactly, what I do too. So data analytics tools, that whole idea that, I went to the National Association of Realtors convention, I guess it was 2 or 3 years before COVID. And the buzzword was data analytics, predictive analytics is what it was. It was, looking at big data sets of county records and making an informed data-driven guess at who's likely to move this year versus last. I think that some of that, was pie in the sky, but I do think with artificial intelligence and the massive data we've accumulated from so many different sources that we can't imagine what may be coming our way. Marketing platforms, it's getting easier and easier, thanks to Zillow, Realtor, and so forth, to get really good, professional looking advertising out there in the world for our listings.
Yeah. So one of the things I think about is who can be first to make this process, buying or selling a home, easier, right? And we think about that and we've talked about this before.
Let me interrupt, and I apologize, but I don't want to lose this thought. It's not just easier, Laci. I think what we all need, including realtors, buyers, and sellers, is making the process more predictable. And right now, you've got a million agents that all put their own spin on it. And that creates not just uncertainty, but that unpredictability creates anxiety. And I'm not saying that we should all be McDonald's and the hamburger should taste the same everywhere, but we do need a bit more conformity, I think, as scary as that may be. So anyway.
No, that's my exact point. Up to this point, I've thought about it as who's going to be the first to put a buy now button on Zillow, right? And just make the process, like the logistics of it, easier. But there's this human element right now where, what if your agent misses a house that would be perfect for you? Or, what, as an example, right? But with AI and predictive data and all of those advancements technologically, like who's going to be the first that can look at an agent profile, partially that they've filled out themselves, partially that they've imported some kind of readily available data, and match them to their perfect home that's for sale in their area they're looking for, in the price, like within their price range, right? And spit out, this is your, this is the home that's most likely going to be the one that you're going to buy. And it turns out they're right. Right. Like, and so you take out all of the appointments, all of the time. So it's not just the logistics. It's really that, right. This is looking further ahead. This might be a next week conversation, but
but here's the other thing. You and I have talked about this. You're a content creator, right? You're a writer, you're a researcher. And we've talked about how, we both are learning to use ChatGPT and Google's Bard as tools to make us more productive, not to do our jobs for us, but it provides resources and structure that allows us to add greater value to those we work with. And I think the new real estate professional is going to embrace all these tools, whether it's Zillow or predictive analytics or ChatGPT or whatever, and they're going to 10 times, their capability, their efficiencies, their personal expertise, and in turn, exponentially increase their value to the clients they choose to work with. That, I think, is ultimately where this goes. But, spoiler alert, that means that agents who embrace that mindset are going to do a heck of a lot more transactions than they do today. And it's going to mean that we need fewer realtors in the system, right? You're going to lose some realtors because of the buy button. And then you're going to lose some realtors because a handful among us are going to get really good at what we do, and we're going to be able to scale. So I think that's what's going to happen. It's just hard to say exactly what the steps are going to be one by one, but I think that's where we're going. I think you're going to see fewer generalists, right, and more specialists by market segment. Our friend Dean talks about being hyperlocal. I think hyperlocal is valuable. Right? If you're looking to move to Provo, Utah, you want the person in Provo, Utah that knows not just Provo, Utah, but the subdivision in the street that you live in. So local expertise and focus are going to be critical. And I think the idea of one target market at a time is critical if your primary focus as a professional is market making, right? So when, some of the stuff we're working on for next year, we've got the Space Coast Condo Guide launching. And, we want RENA to become the absolute go-to specialist for oceanfront condos on the Space Coast of Florida. That's a niche market. It's it's not broad. It's one thing, but we can go incredibly deep into that and become the experts. Another thing that we're looking at launching next year is Champaign County. It's a rural area near Springfield and Dayton. And we are going to become the absolute go-to experts on any piece of land that is larger than 100 acres, right? So in these rural areas, land turns, but land turns within, quote, the market, just like commercial real estate used to. So, it's not like you can just put a deal together by being a realtor and stick it in the MLS. You've got to become a market maker. So hyper local expertise and focus, one target market at a time, go deep, build your business in those niches one at a time. And I think that's going to be the wave of the future. I think in general, with increased competition and compression, brokers and owners have to prioritize customer satisfaction. And, we got to attract, you got to retain clients, you've got to earn their referrals. So, one thing that I've been thinking about is, and, we're going to talk about this next week and all into next year, we do property management as well as, helping people buy and sell houses. And I think the concept that is really driving my thinking next year and well beyond is, have I earned a 5-star review today? If your whole culture, thought process, actual processes revolve around, have I earned a 5-star review today? I think that positively influences everything we do and how we do it. Real estate brokers and owners, are going to be looking for ways to expand their reach. So they're going to be collaborating with new people in the market. It could be online platforms. It could be homeowner counseling organizations. But I think what's going to happen is, if we do get to a point where there's extreme decoupling, and I can tell you that any mortgage company, any banker is going to be far more comfortable lending money to a first-time buyer who has quality representation versus somebody who's going out there and doing it on their own. That is going to be a better loan for a bank to make for an educated buyer than a non-educated buyer. So, I think that's something that may become, a lot of, great realtors have, productive relationships with one or two lending professionals. But I do think, especially in the case of decoupling, that we're going to see more of that. I mean, I can't imagine lending money to somebody who's a first-time buyer who is on their own. I would be much more likely and think that loan is going to perform a hell of a lot better on average if they've had representation. I think you're going to see lots of consolidation. Brokers are going to go out of business. Their agents are going to go elsewhere. Brokers are going to be bought out. I think services are going to become, it's nice for us because we do property management as well. So we've got a rehab and maintenance company that, for me as a broker, it's another stream of income. It's another opportunity to add value. It helps us with sales. It helps us with management. Management helps us with sales and vice versa. So I do think that you're going to see a lot of different things come together that we haven't thought of before. But at the end of the day, the whole industry is going to get way, way more productive. Sort of like we just talked about. The best among us are going to do way more units. So for me, it's always been units closed per agent is the critical metric, not dollars. So we're going to focus on units, but it also means we're going to be focusing on metrics like return on relationship. And, that's what Dean Jackson's been, teaching for years and years. It makes perfect sense. If you work by referral, knowing that metric is key. And I think it's key for broker owners as well, not just individual agents. The most dangerous agents in the world, Laci, are those that do 1 or 2 deals a year. That's where our liability is. The agents that do 2, 3, 4 deals a month, whatever it is, they're the ones that are in the thick of it, learning every single day. That's not where our liability is. Our liabilities are with the people who don't produce. Anyway, I'm going on and on. We're getting ahead of ourselves. One other thing I just want to say, this has been a tough year for broker owners, but honestly, it's been a tough few years for broker owners. And I think that we are finally going to get tired, I know I have, of taking on legal liability for less than the compensation that we deserve. And everything for me has to come down to providing greater and greater value to our agents so they can make more and more money and live the lifestyle they want. If they get paid, we as brokers get paid. And if that's not the wave now, and it should be, it's going to be the way of the future. And the last thing is, if NAR does start to fade away as, I guess, as our voice to the world, we as individual brokers, and I don't know what this is going to look like, but we are going to have to step up and do what we have allowed NAR to do for us all these years for ourselves. And, we're going to talk more about that next time. But, these are things that could come down the pike. That's not necessarily a fun one. I think the fun one is what are the business opportunities going to look like? And how can we help people seize those opportunities? So I feel like I'm going on and I can't stop, Laci. So let's get close to the end.
Let's wrap it up. Well, I think that the last thing I've taken from this is the return on relationship. If you're going to be a market maker, in rural Ohio, then you're going to have to know the folks who could potentially be selling their land before they decide to sell their land, right? You're going to really have to be a member of a community. If you're going to, have a niche in the Space Coast, you're going to have to be involved in that community. And it just really drives home, I think, again, in a very tangible way, why relationship-driven professionals are going to be at an advantage when this happens. If that's the thing that you're going to do to succeed, if that's what needs to happen, if that makes it easier, right, then all of the things that you have in place, like being a member of your community, supporting your community financially, pop buys for past clients, and just people in your Rolodex, reaching out individually to those folks once a month or sending them a postcard to remind them that, hey, we're still here whenever you're ready, right?
Yeah,
whenever
exactly.
You're ready, here's how we can help. That you're just really well positioned for this, which is huge. And I think it's going to be huge. I think you're going to see when you talk about other brokers, kind of finding their own way. I think that you're going to see a lot of other brokers do what Roost is already doing, if that's the way forward. So that's exciting.
But here's 5 things, specific things that I really urge everybody listening to start doing today. Okay, so the first one is, if you're not already familiar, get familiar with exclusive buyer agency agreements. I believe this is the way. I've resisted these, but it's time to get on board. The second thing is show your value. And if you feel you've been doing that, what's the next level, right? How are you going to better show your value? Better yet, how are you going to add additional value? You've got to be able to articulate what you bring to the table. It's going to be a lot easier to get a signature on a buyer representation agreement or a buyer agency agreement if you can show your potential client exactly why they shouldn't go it alone. Number 3, educate. And it's not just educating the client that's across the kitchen table from you. We have to educate customers as well as clients. And specifically, we have to educate them about the manner in which we get paid. Transparency is key. Here's another great practical tip. Don't pre-fill your listing documents with any numbers or any percentage, especially a cooperative percentage. Okay. All commissions are negotiable. If you have a pre-filled number in there when you put it in front of or send it to dot loop to a seller or a buyer, that absolutely changes the perception that commissions are negotiable, and it makes it look like they're fixed. Don't pre-fill anything. Never, ever, this is the last one today, never insinuate to a seller that failure to agree to a certain co-op percentage or a certain dollar will result in fewer agents showing their property. You can't do it. That's contrary to what NAR says, and it's contrary to state law, I believe, in every single state, right? It is contrary to your fiduciary legal duty to a buyer to not show a property that would be perfect for them if the buyer co-op isn't the amount of money you think you deserve, right? And this goes back to that discussion of being able to search listings based on the co-op and potentially having an agent only show the ones that pay the most. Yes, that could happen. Yes, it's wrong. But I also just want to stress the fact that it's contrary to state licensing law. So never, ever insinuate that a seller's failure to pop 3% or 4% or whatever it is into that co-op figure on your listing agreement is going to result in fewer realtors showing the property, because that is a clear and present violation of antitrust law. So please don't do it.
Love it. Practical tips are a great way to end it, I think. This is the day-to-day. This is the way, like you said.
Well, those are the 5 things that we can all do right now, regardless of how this whole thing turns out. And, we've done 4 of these so far. And those are the things that I've definitely changed in my business already, having, dug into this.
Well, it sounds like you might need to host a seminar. So on the practical aspects, we can talk about philosophy all day long, but when it comes down to it, it's what is this checklist, right? That I need to do every day to make sure that I'm on, everything stays on the up and up. So thanks again for taking the time, Chris, to get into all of this, because I know it's a lot of time, and sharing your takeaways with the folks who maybe don't have or can't make that time right now.
Always a pleasure, Laci. Thank you.
See you next time.
And there we have it. Thanks for listening in. If you want to continue the conversation, go to www.connectpracticetrackgrow.com. That's connectpracticetrackgrow.com, where we have additional information about the podcast, archived episodes, and an option you can select to be a guest on the show. We'd love to hear from you. So that's it. We'll be back next time with another episode of the Connect, Practice, Track, and Grow podcast.